The short, scorching summer of 1999. In a god-forsaken village in the Krasnodar region, where life flows slowly, like resin down a pine tree trunk, an entire family disappears without a trace. 4 people, a husband, wife, and 2 small children, vanished into the sultry haze. Neighbors shrugged their shoulders. They left to find work. It happens to everyone. But a year later, the terrible truth will burst out from under the ground, and even the most steadfast investigators will be stunned by it. From the gray, cracked concrete in the middle of an abandoned forest strip, a thick woman's braid would stick out, becoming a silent pointer to a mass grave in which not only people were buried alive, but also any belief in humanity. The summer of 1999 was particularly stifling and sluggish in the Krasnodar region. The sun melted the asphalt on the few roads leading to the farms, which were lost among the endless fields of sunflowers. The air trembled with heat and the chirping of cicadas, and it seemed that in this sleepy, heat-weary silence, nothing could happen that would disrupt the centuries-old way of life. The village of Kalanovi, a few dozen houses scattered on both sides of a dusty street, was just such a place. Here everyone knew each other by sight, knew whose chicken had died, and whose son had returned from the army. Life was simple, complex, and predictable. And that is why, when the Nefedov family did not leave their house one morning, it was not noticed immediately. Sergei Nefedov, a 42-year-old local, was a resident. Strong, taciturn, with hands that seemed to have been made for working with earth and metal. He had worked all his life as a mechanic on a collective farm, and when it collapsed, he got by with odd jobs, repairing tractors for some, welding fences for others. His wife, Elena, a 38-year-old beauty with thick blonde hair that fell to her waist, was the heart and soul of their small but cozy home. She had come to the farm from a neighboring district 15 years ago, and her quiet smile and ringing laughter quickly made her everyone's favorite. They had 2 children, 12-year-old Andrei, a boy who was serious beyond his years and the spitting image of his father, and 7-year-old Olya, a freckled ray of sunshine with her mother's eyes. The family was not wealthy, but they lived happily together. Their yard was always well kept. Dahlias bloomed in the front garden, and in the evenings, the laughter of children and the quiet voices of their parents could often be heard from the open windows. They were part of this farmstead, indistinguishable from the old acacia trees and creaky well cranes. The disappearance happened silently, without screams or broken doors. One July morning, their neighbor, Baba Nina, went out to milk the goat, as usual. She glanced at the Nefedovs' yard and was surprised by the silence. Usually at this time, Sergei was already tinkering with his old Moskvich, and Lena was hanging out the laundry. But today, their yard was empty. The gate was ajar. Yesterday's towel was still hanging on the rope, and their faithful dog, a mongrel named Pirate, was whining at the locked door, but did not respond to Baba Nina's call. Maybe they left for the regional center early in the morning, thought the old woman, and went about her business. But they did not return for lunch or dinner. The next day, the silence became oppressive. The door to the house was not locked, but only closed. Inside, everything was in its place. There was a plate of uneaten porridge on the table, and the coals in the stove had cooled down. In the children's room, Ollie's forgotten rag doll was sitting on the bed. Everything looked as if the owners had gone out for a minute and were about to return. But they did not return. The first version, which arose spontaneously and quickly took root in the villagers' minds, was the most prosaic for those uncertain times. They went to work, 100%. Viktor Storojuk, their closest neighbor, confidently declared at a spontaneous meeting at the well. He was a man of about 45, sullen, unsociable, living alone in a dilapidated house across the road. Sergei complained to me more than once that he had no money and no work. He said he was going north or something, to work as a security guard. So they left, apparently. They didn't tell anyone so as not to jinx it. This version satisfied everyone. The 90s were a time of great upheaval and wild hopes. People left their homes, moved to big cities, construction sites, and northern fishing grounds in search of a better life, often without warning, so that no one could dissuade them or ask them for money. The local police officer, who arrived a week later at the request of the village council chairman, lazily inspected the empty house, questioned the neighbors, and, hearing the unanimous response, "Away working," wrote the standard phrase in his report: "Location unknown, no grounds for criminal proceedings." That was the end of the matter. Time passed. Summer gave way to a rainy autumn. Then a snowy winter arrived. The Nefedovs' house looked forlornly out onto the street, its dark windows casting a somber atmosphere. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint on the fence was peeling. The neighbors fed the dog, Pirate, but after a couple of months he disappeared somewhere. People had grown accustomed to the Nefedovs' absence. Their names were mentioned less and less, and only Baba Nina, passing by, would sigh from time to time, looking at the abandoned front garden, where the most beautiful dahlias in the village once bloomed. She alone felt some inexplicable anxiety. One detail bothered her. Elena would never have left her flowers. She cared for them as if they were small children, and she certainly would not have gone without saying goodbye or leaving the house in someone's care. And then there was that strange conversation shortly before her disappearance. Sergei Nefedov, usually reserved, complained to the men at the village store that an almost new welding machine and several metal sheets, which he had been saving for roof repairs, had disappeared from his yard. He didn't say it directly, but everyone understood who he was thinking of. His gaze kept turning toward Viktor Storozhuk's house. The conflict was hushed up at the time, as there was no evidence, but an unpleasant feeling remained. After that, Storozhuk became even gloomier and more withdrawn, and when he met Sergei, he turned away demonstratively. But who would have thought that this petty domestic quarrel, a common occurrence in a poor village where people stole anything they could get their hands on, would be the prologue to a tragedy that would shake the entire region? No one. And the Kalinovi farmstead continued to live its quiet, measured life, keeping a terrible secret buried in the earth and concrete just a couple of kilometers from the outskirts. For a whole year, this secret would wait for its moment, until chance, as often happens in the most terrifying stories, brought it to light. A year passed. The summer of 2000 was as hot as the previous one. The Kalinov farmstead lived its life. The abandoned Nefedov house was hardly noticed anymore. It had become just part of the landscape, a silent reproach to human indifference. The children made up scary stories about it, saying that shadows flashed in the dark windows at night, but the adults just waved them off. The version about the earnings finally became the official story. Viktor Storozhuk, their neighbor, had become gaunt over the course of the year and withdrawn even more into himself. He sold the Nefedovs' old Moskvich, which was rusting under his shed, claiming that Sergei had allegedly left him the car for debts, and no one argued. Life completely erased the traces of the missing family, but the earth, unlike people, can only keep secrets for so long. One day in August, two local teenagers, 14-year-old Kostya and his peer Dimka, bored and sweltering in the heat, decided to go to the distant forest belt behind the farm. The place was considered dangerous. At one time, they had begun to build an irrigation canal there. Still, the Soviet Union's collapse led to the project's abandonment. All that remained were flooded trenches overgrown with weeds and a few concrete rings piled up in a heap. The boys went there in search of scrap metal. In those days, it was a popular way to earn pocket money. They were wandering among the thickets of acacia and blackthorn when they stumbled upon something strange. In the middle of a small clearing, hidden from prying eyes by thick bushes, stood a lone concrete well. It was not an old one lined with stone, but a modern one assembled from two massive factory rings of the kind used for sewage systems. It looked out of place in this abandoned place. It was carelessly covered with a sheet of rusty roofing iron. Curiosity got the better of them. Pushing the sheet aside, the boys looked inside. They expected to see murky water, trash, anything but this. The well was almost filled to the top with a solid gray mass. Concrete. The surface was uneven, bumpy, as if the mortar had been poured in a hurry and had solidified in waves. "Look, someone just filled it in so no one could climb down," Dimka said disappointedly, getting ready to leave. But Kostya, who was more observant, froze. His gaze was caught by something strange at the very edge of the concrete plug. A dark, thick bundle protruded from the gray, rough surface, resembling old tow or a bunch of horsehair sprinkled with cement dust. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, and, finding a long, dry branch, carefully poked at the find. The dust fell away, and under the scorching sun, it became clearly visible. It wasn't two. It was a thick, tightly braided woman's braid, blonde, with a few gray hairs. It came straight out of the concrete, like a last, desperate greeting from a grave that no one knew about. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence, broken only by the ringing in their ears. And then, without saying a word, the boys ran away, screaming wildly in terror. They rushed through the thorny bushes, heedless of their destination, driven by a sticky, primal fear. They did not stop until they ran, gasping and stumbling, onto the main street of the village. Their confused, hysterical story about a hand from under the ground and hair from a well was initially met with only smiles. "You're making it up again, you fools. Has the sun fried your brains?" grumbled the chairman. But there was such genuine horror in the children's eyes that even the most hardened skeptics wavered. A group of men gathered. Taking shovels and crowbars, they followed the frightened teenagers to the forest. Viktor Starojuk also came out of his yard, attracted by the noise. Hearing what was going on, he turned pale as a sheet and muttered through clenched teeth. "It's all nonsense. Children's fairy tales." But for some reason, he refused to go with everyone else, remaining standing at his gate and nervously smoking one cigarette after another. When the men reached the well and saw with their own eyes what the boys had described, the laughter and jokes instantly died down. A heavy, oppressive silence fell. The adults, men hardened by life, stood unable to take their eyes off this nightmarish detail. A blonde braid embedded in concrete. Many of them immediately remembered Elena Nefedova. Her luxurious braid was her pride and joy, and everyone in the village knew her. The realization was slow, unthinkable, but inevitable, like an approaching storm. A year of consolation and self-deception collapsed in an instant. The Nefedovs hadn't left. They were here. All this time they had been here, underfoot, in this terrible concrete grave. Someone ran to call the police. This time, it wasn't a sleepy local cop who arrived, but an entire investigative team from the regional center. The area was cordoned off. Camera flashes flashed. People in uniform questioned the villagers, who had gathered in a crowd at the edge of the forest, afraid to come closer, but unable to leave. The news of the terrible discovery spread through the village like wildfire, carrying with it a sticky horror. Everyone now looked at their neighbors in a new way, and in every glance there was a silent question. Who? Who could have done such a thing? As dusk fell, powerful jackhammers and a generator were brought to the well. In the light of the spotlights, the gruesome and challenging work of opening the concrete tomb began. The sound of the jackhammer gnawing into the hardened cement echoed through the nighttime farmstead, and it seemed that it was not the equipment working, but the earth itself groaning in pain and horror. The investigators and operatives worked in silence, their faces stony, but even they, who had seen a lot, felt uneasy. They did not yet know what they would find under this 1.5-meter layer of concrete. Still, They already understood that they were dealing with one of the most brutal and cold-blooded crimes in the history of the region. And the main question hanging in the night air was about the motive. What could have compelled a person not only to kill, but to bury alive or dead an entire family with small children with such monstrous methodicalness? The answer to this question was much closer and simpler than anyone could have imagined, and it was hidden behind a crooked fence on a quiet farm street. The jackhammers stopped well after midnight. Forensic experts took turns chipping away at the monolithic gray mass, centimeter by centimeter. At first, it was just hard work, but soon it turned into a nightmarish archaeological dig. The first things to appear were scraps of fabric embedded in the concrete, calico with a small floral pattern from a woman's robe. And then, when the layer of concrete was broken through, the spotlight revealed what everyone had feared. Under half a meter of cement lay a body. Elena was the first. She was found lying on her side, in the very position in which she had apparently fallen into the narrow mouth of the well. Her famous braid was thrown behind her back, and when the mortar was poured in, its end ended up on top, becoming a terrible beacon. The medical examiner, an older man with an impenetrable face who seemed to have seen everything in his lifetime, struggled to contain his emotions. He noted that there were no apparent fatal injuries on the body that could be determined on the spot. The position of the body, and the fact that her mouth was open, as if in a silent scream, suggested the most terrible version. She was most likely thrown into the well while still alive. The concrete solution, thick and heavy, would have given her no chance to get out, or even breathe. She was buried alive. This discovery was only the beginning of a descent into hell. Under Elena's body, mixed with lumps of concrete and earth, investigators found the remains of her husband, Sergei. His powerful body was contorted in an unnatural position, one arm stretched upward, as if he had tried to defend himself or push his wife upward until the very end. An expert found a broken wound on his skull, presumably caused by a heavy, blunt object. Unlike his wife, he was probably killed or knocked unconscious before being thrown into the well. But the worst was yet to come, waiting for investigators at the bottom of this makeshift sarcophagus. There, huddled together, lay two children. 12-year-old Andrei was hugging his younger sister, 7-year-old Olya, as if trying to protect her, even after death. They had no visible injuries. They were just there, at the bottom, with their parents' bodies lying on top of them. This scene shocked even the most experienced operatives. One of the young police sergeants silently turned away and vomited. Work stopped for a few minutes. In the deafening silence of the night forest, only the heavy breathing of the men who had encountered absolute, unbridled evil could be heard. It became clear that this was not just a murder. It was an execution, a show trial, and a merciless massacre of an entire family. At dawn, the village of Kalinovi woke up in a different place. The atmosphere of sleepy tranquility had evaporated, replaced by a sticky, pervasive fear. People came out of their houses and silently looked toward the cordoned-off forest. Now everyone was asking themselves, how could they have lived peacefully for a whole year, knowing that their neighbors, their children, were walled up a few kilometers from their homes? And the main question was, who? Investigators began their methodical work. Repeated interrogations were now conducted for more than just a formality. The villagers, shaken to the core, recalled details that they had not previously considered significant. They remembered Sergei Nefedov's quarrel with Viktor Storozhuk over theft. They remembered that just a couple of days after the family's disappearance, Storozhuk had started some work in his yard, mixing cement and claiming he was pouring the floor in the barn. At the time, no one was surprised. Now, however, these memories took on a sinister meaning. The story of the Nefedovs' car sale also resurfaced. No one believed the story about debts, but no one wanted to get involved with the sullen and aggressive Storozhuk. Now everything came together into one terrible picture. A task force with a search warrant entered Viktor Storozhuk's yard. He met them at the door, pale, his hands shaking, but trying to act bold. "What do you want? I don't have anything. I already told you everything. They're gone," he shouted. But his eyes betrayed his animal fear. The search yielded immediate results. In the far corner of the shed, under a pile of old sacks, Nefedov's welding machine was found. And nearby, in the dust, lay several empty paper bags from PC400 cement. The expert working at the well immediately confirmed that, judging by its chemical composition, this was the same cement that had been used to fill the bodies. But the final, decisive piece of evidence was found in the rubbish pit behind the shed. There, covered with earth and ash, lay a child's sandal. It was a small, worn-out sandal belonging to 7-year-old Olya Nefedova. The guard was taken by the arms and led to the car. He did not resist. He went limp, as if all the air had been let out of him. The interrogation began at the district police station. For the first 2 hours, he remained silent, staring blankly at the wall and repeating the same thing. "I don't know anything. It wasn't me." The investigator, an experienced psychologist, did not press him. He calmly and methodically laid out photographs on the table in front of him. Pictures of the happy Nefedov family, taken a month before their death. Photographs of the terrible discovery in the well. And then he placed a small sandal on the table. "Do you remember Olya, Victor?" the investigator asked quietly. "She called you Uncle Vitya. You sometimes gave her candy. Why did you do that to her? What did she do to you?" And at that moment, the dam broke. Storozhuk's face contorted into a grimace. He covered it with his hands and shook with silent sobs. For several minutes he couldn't utter a word, shaking with convulsions. And then finally, he raised his red, crazed eyes to the investigator and whispered hoarsely, "I didn't want to. It just happened. He started it. I killed them all. Yes, it was me." In the gray, official silence of the interrogation room, under a single dim lamp, Viktor Storozhuk began his story. It was not a remorseful confession, but rather a monotonous, emotionless account of the mechanics of evil. The investigators listened, and a chill ran down their spines, because the most frightening thing about his words was how ordinary and simple it all was. There was no demonic intent or high tragedy in his story, only a viscous, suffocating quagmire of envy, cowardice, and panic. It all began, as expected, with that very theft. The guard, perpetually penniless and embittered toward the whole world, had long had his eye on the Nefedovs' well-run farm. He saw how Sergei worked tirelessly, how their home was filled with a harmony he had never known. He did not hate them openly, but their quiet family happiness was a daily, silent reproach to him, a lonely bachelor. He stole the welding machine and sheets of metal not so much out of necessity as out of petty, malicious envy, so that his neighbor would be at least a little worse off. On that fateful evening, Sergei Nefedov came to his yard. He didn't shout or threaten. He just looked Storozhuk in the eye and said, "Vitya, I know it was you. Give it back nicely, and we'll forget about it. I don't want to report it to the police. We're neighbors, after all." And this calm confidence, this generosity, infuriated Storozhuk more than if Sergei had attacked him with his fists. In his sick mind, it seemed like humiliation. He began to deny everything, shout, and a quarrel ensued. They went into the shed, where Sergei saw his device in the corner. He silently stepped toward it to pick it up, and at that moment, something clicked in Storozhuk's head. The panic of being exposed mixed with years of pent-up anger. He grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a piece of rusty rebar lying on the floor. One blow to the back of the head. Sergei gasped and collapsed heavily onto the dirt floor. For several minutes, as Storozhuk recounted, he stood over the body, not understanding what he had done. And then came the icy horror. He was a murderer. What to do? Hide the body. But where? And then he heard Elena calling him from the street. "Sergei, where are you?" Her voice was his sentence. He realized that she was a witness. She knew that her husband had gone to see him. Then his brain began to work with devilish, devious logic. He came out of the gate, pretending to be worried. "Lena, there's trouble," he said, gasping for breath. "Sergei and I went to the forest, where I had something hidden. He stumbled and fell into an old well. He's alive, but I think he broke his leg. I can't pull him out by myself, help me." There was so much despair in his words that Elena, distraught with fear for her husband, did not hesitate for a second. She ran after him without even stopping at the house. Everything happened in an instant at the well. He asked her to look inside, supposedly to call Sergei, to give him a voice. And when she, unsuspecting, leaned over the concrete edge, he pushed her hard in the back. He heard her short cry and a dull thud below. He didn't know if she had died immediately, but he didn't care anymore. Now there were two at the bottom of the well. Returning to the farmstead under the cover of dusk, he realized that he wasn't done. The children were still there. Andrei and Olya. They would start looking for their parents and raise the alarm. They were the last threads leading to him. In his mind, distorted by fear, they were no longer children, but dangerous witnesses who had to be eliminated. He approached the Nefedovs' house. The door was open. The children were sitting in the room, waiting for their parents. "Uncle Vitya, where are Mom and Dad?" Andrei asked. "They're waiting for you somewhere. They want to surprise you," he lied, trying not to let his voice tremble. "They said to bring you. Let's go quickly." The children, who had known him all their lives, followed him without complaint into the gathering darkness. He didn't remember what they talked about on the way. He only remembered the sticky horror and one thought: hurry up and get it over with. He recounted what happened at the well incoherently, getting confused. He either pushed them or made them jump, promising that their parents were waiting for them at the bottom. He didn't want to go into details, and the investigators didn't insist. The picture was already horrific. The most methodical part began later. All night, until dawn, he acted like a machine. He had a dozen bags of cement left over from construction in his shed. He wheeled sand from the nearest beam in a wheelbarrow, mixed the mortar in an old trough, and poured it into the well with buckets. Bucket after bucket. He heard moans, or so it seemed. He didn't know. He just poured and poured until the gray mass covered everything. He wanted to bury his secret so deep that it would never be found. When the work was done, he covered the well with a sheet of iron, threw branches over it, and staggered home. He burned his blood-stained clothes and cleaned out the shed. The next day, he was the first to confidently announce to the whole farm, "The Nefedovs have left to find work." And they believed him. He lived with this for an entire year, turning into a sullen shadow. Every day he waited to be exposed, and that anticipation was worse than any torture. When he finished speaking, a heavy silence hung in the office. The investigator, a gray-haired colonel who had seen dozens of murderers during his service, looked silently at this man. He saw neither a monster nor a maniac in him. He saw a pitiful, cowardly creature who, having stumbled once, decided not to get out, but to drag everyone around him into the abyss. The story of the brutal massacre of the Nefedov family turned out to be the story of one insignificant soul who was afraid of responsibility for a stolen welding machine. The trial of Viktor Storozhuk became the most high-profile trial in the district's history. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Almost all the residents of the Kalinovi farmstead came to look into the eyes of the man who had lived among them for a whole year, greeting them, buying bread in the same store as them, knowing what he had done. Storozhuk looked broken and 20 years older in the dock. He did not look at the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the floor. He fully admitted his guilt and answered the judge's questions monosyllabically and indifferently. The trial was short. The evidence was irrefutable, confessions supported by expert reports and evidence discovered during the search. In his speech, The prosecutor called the crime an act of extreme cruelty that has no justification in human society and demanded the maximum punishment. The lawyer tried to emphasize that the first murder was committed in the heat of passion, but the subsequent cold-blooded and methodical actions to eliminate witnesses, especially children, left the court with no room for maneuver. The verdict was expected and harsh: life imprisonment in a special regime colony. In those years, Russia already had a moratorium on the death penalty, and this was the maximum punishment possible. When the judge read out the sentence, there was dead silence in the courtroom. No one shouted or applauded. There was only a feeling of emptiness and some bitter, belated justice. Storozhuk was led out of the courtroom, and no one in the area ever saw him again. But for the village of Kalinovi, the story did not end with the verdict. It left a deep, unhealed scar on his heart. The world of the small, quiet village, where everyone trusted each other, collapsed. Neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion. Now anyone could be hiding behind every sullen glance or careless word. The Nefedovs' house remained empty and abandoned, like a monument to tragedy. No one wanted to buy it, and over time, it turned into gloomy ruins overgrown with weeds. Storozhuk's house also became empty, and his distant relatives hastened to sell it to newcomers for a pittance who knew nothing about its history. The well in the forest belt was filled with earth by order of the authorities and leveled with a bulldozer so that it would no longer remind anyone of what had happened. But it was impossible to erase it from people's memories. The place became cursed. Even years later, children avoided it, and adults passing by involuntarily quickened their pace. The Nefedov family, Sergei, Elena, Andrei, and Olya, were buried in the local cemetery. 4 modest graves side by side. The entire village came to say goodbye to them a second time, now for real. And many cried not only out of pity for the innocently murdered, but also out of shame for their own blindness, for so easily believing a convenient lie and allowing the murderer to walk among them for a whole year. Years later, life in the village of Kalinovi returned to normal outwardly. But something had changed forever. This story became a terrible legend, whispered as a warning that the most horrendous evil does not always come from outside with loud cries and threats. Sometimes it lives quietly behind a neighbor's fence, in the soul of an ordinary, unremarkable person, waiting for just one spark to burn everything around it to the ground. And this simple, frightening truth has forever settled in the hearts of those who remember the hot summer of '99 and the terrible discovery in the concrete well.